So there's a movie trailer that's been making its way around the internet. I saw it on Facebook yesterday, and I'm really excited about it. It's a movie about Mr. Rogers, and it's called "Would You Be My Neighbor?" I think is the name of it. And I'm definitely interested in this. I've been wanting somebody to make either a biopic about Fred Rogers or a documentary, a good documentary about him for a while now. Because, and I say this without irony, I honestly think he might be one of the greatest people that's ever walked the earth. Honestly. Um, a lot of us grew up with Mr. Rogers, and it brings back a lot of nostalgia. Um, I've heard people say that like the safest they've ever felt in their lives was sitting at their grandparents' home watching Mr. Rogers on TV. So there's a nostalgia factor. There's a part of us that just kind of transports back to our childhood when we think about Mr. Rogers. There's all that, but everything that I've read about this guy makes me think this is the kind of person we all should want to be. I've heard all these stories. There was a cab driver that picked him up somewhere, and they got started talking while he was being driven to wherever it was he was being driven, and he basically asked if he could go meet the guy's family, the cab driver's family. Cab driver winds up driving him to his house, meeting his family. Mr. Rogers gets on the piano, they sing songs, they have a good time. He may have stayed for dinner or something like that. And then the cab driver drove him home, and the driver was like, "It was the most amazing thing I've ever witnessed. This person just came into this house and brought all this joy and everything." And the thing about it, and this is from everything that I've ever read, every interaction I've ever heard anybody say about him, is that he was just the most remarkable person, the most loving, caring, genuinely interested in you person. Like when he met somebody, he genuinely wanted to know all about them, all about their lives. He just wanted to absorb as much as he could of other people and give as much as he could to them. There was no barrier there. He didn't put up a wall. He was like there, and he was into it. He wanted to be there with you. And that's a very hard thing to do. When I look at it, I break it down to, before I get to that, actually, another thing that he was known for doing was, first of all, he pretty much made children's public television possible. I mean, there's a video that's been shared on Facebook a million times, probably many more than a million times, where he testified before Congress and basically got these hardcore, I want to say Republicans just because they were fiscally conservative, but they didn't want to spend this money for public television. And he basically went up there and gave an impassioned speech, talk, testimony to these guys and changed their minds. And I mean, you see this politician just like, well, you convinced me. I wasn't going to go this way, but yeah, I think you're right. He also, I think, had a lot to do with the adoption of the VCR because people could record his shows and play them back for their kids later on. Mr. Rogers and porn had a lot to do with the adoption of the VCR. Two very different things. But no, where I was going a second ago, so I mean, sorry, I'm bouncing around a little bit. He spurred on public television, he spurred on VCR technology and that kind of thing, but he also was willing to talk about hard things with kids, divorce. He was doing this back in the 60s when Bobby Kennedy was shot and Martin Luther King. He talked about these things. He made it okay to talk to kids about very difficult subjects at a time when nobody else was doing that. He was very racially equal. He had, black kids on and Hispanic kids, like kids of all colors on his show at a time when that was just not done. And there's a very famous moment when there was a guy that played a cop, a black dude who was a cop on the show, and he had this guy sit down with him and soak his feet in a little pool, and they just kind of had a little conversation while they were soaking their feet, kind of to get out of the heat of the summer kind of thing. But that was done at a time when there were black people not being allowed to swim in public pools with the white kids. And he did something like that to change people's minds, especially to change the minds of children as they got older, to kind of root out this sort of racism and stuff like that. But it all comes down to me to a very fundamental thing, and I'm not the person that made this up. This is an old adage but it's basically you have a choice of living through love or living through fear. And I've always said anger is not the opposite of love. Fear is the opposite of love. I've said that in a video before. But I'm as guilty of this as anybody, but I think we go through our lives mostly making decisions based out of fear. And it's a struggle to turn that around and think, like in any particular situation when you have to make a decision, think, what would be the choice I would make here if I was making this choice out of love instead of fear? You know, whether it's taking a new job, whether it's getting into a relationship, whether it's just people inviting you to go out some night and you're sitting there like, oh, do I have to do this? You know, I'm terrible about that. People invite me out and I'm just like, I have to go somewhere. I have to be around people. And I try really hard when I get into moments like that of uncertainty, of indecision, to just stop and be like, what is the love decision here? What is preventing me from doing this? What is my hesitation? Is it love or is it fear? And it's 99% of the time it's fear. But he's a guy who lived through love and displayed that for everybody. He led with love, and that's something that we should all do. Another example of this that I thought was interesting, and this speaks to Mr. Rogers was not somebody that you would call especially manly. But I think there's room, and there needs to be a lot more room for that form of masculinity. There is a type of masculinity that leads with love, that leads with caring for people. We've gotten so toxic about our masculinity in society today. It's like you got to punch somebody in the face. You got to be mean. You got to suppress your emotions, never cry, never tell people how you feel. It's just gotten so out of hand with that. And he was a guy who embodied that. Another example, I started to say a second ago, there's a movie called Buck, and it's about, and I can't remember the guy's last name, but obviously his name was Buck. It was a documentary about the guy who, the movie The Horse Whisperer and the book The Horse Whisperer was inspired by this dude. He's a horse trainer, and he basically travels around to different places, and he does workshops with people to help them get control of horses that are problem horses, whether they're show horses or whether they're just horses that they raise and sell or whatever, training. And the thing that really struck me about this movie, and I encourage you, absolutely do a search on YouTube for Buck the movie trailer, and it'll give you a great idea of what I'm talking about here. But this is a guy, he was a horse trainer. He was a cowboy. He wore the hat. He looked like he was right out of Central Casting with the clothes that he wore, with the tassels and everything. Like he was a cowboy. He was about as manly as you can get. He looked like the Marlboro Man, right? But in the way he dealt with people and the way he dealt with horses, it came purely out of love. It was love with boundaries. Like he would tell you to your face, he told you what you needed to hear. And sometimes that wasn't always pretty, but it always came from a place of love. You could tell. And it was just something, I saw that movie and I walked away from it and I was like, that's who I want to be. Because one of the flaws that I have is when I love, I tend to let go of other things, like my boundaries. I tend to let go of protecting myself, defending myself. I kind of let people walk all over me and get away with things that they shouldn't. And there is a balance there between leading with love, but also protecting yourself and making sure that you're not being taken advantage of. I tend to slip in that last category when I get to going into the whole love thing. But this was a guy that did that. And the thing that I liked about him, and what kind of made me think of the whole Mr. Rogers thing, was like he embodied in so many ways our classic idea of masculinity, but he also did so in a way that led with love. So it's a thing that you can do. It's a thing that we can do. And it's a thing that I'm working on. So I'm excited about this documentary. I really want to hear some more stories about him because, again, every story I've ever heard about Fred Rogers he was just this remarkable human being. He was consistent throughout his entire life. You keep thinking you're going to hear some horrible scandal come out because that always seems to happen with people, but he never did. He was about as famous as a guy could be, but he was uncorruptible. And he he led with his heart, and he wanted nothing but good things for other people, and he wanted to give, and we should all strive to be that. That should be the goal. Anyway, just want to talk about that. I've always super admired Fred Rogers, which might be a funny thing to say coming from a guy who also is a big fan of Bill Hicks, which is the exact opposite of that. But I just think he embodies what we all should strive to be. Anyway, just thought I'd share that. Hope that is valuable to you guys, and I encourage you to look up that video, that trailer. It's really, it looks good. I can't wait to see it. Anyway, you guys have a good one. Take care.